So as folks join, I will get us kicked off. On behalf of the Partnership for Strong Communities, welcome to the plenary session of today's plenary session of Connecticut's Affordable Housing Conference. My name is Chelsea Ross. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Partnership for Strong Communities, and I'm really happy that you all are joining us virtually today. The Partnership for Strong Communities is dedicated to ensuring everyone in Connecticut has a safe, stable home that is affordable to them in an equitable community of their choice. We promote equitable change in Connecticut housing policy by coordinating advocacy, advancing research, and uniting diverse partners. We have an exciting plenary session for you today, halfway through our 3-day conference. In just a minute, you'll hear from national housing leaders as they discuss on-the-ground solutions that can result in a more equitable recovery for COVID-19's hardest hit families and stimulate inclusive growth. Tomorrow, we will start the day with a plenary session at 9 a.m. where you can learn from the expertise of narrative leaders regarding the current public and political climate and how to continue to shift the conversation to support increasing the number of safe, stable, and affordable housing options in Connecticut. At 1:30, we'll host a legislative roundtable featuring a discussion with lobbyists and legislative leaders within the Connecticut General Assembly. Moderated by Bill Wells of Gallo and Robinson, the panel will explore topics including bonding and housing development, zoning, post-COVID relating housing concerns, and more. Following the moderated panel discussion, panelists and legislators will engage in an audience question and answer period. We hope you'll explore the full conference agenda and plan out a schedule that most interests you. A reminder that all sessions will be recorded and made available on our YouTube channel post the conference. None of this is possible without the support of our generous sponsors who make the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference a success and free for you to attend today. Thank you to our leading sponsors and critical partners, the Connecticut Department of Housing and the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority. Thank you to leading sponsor La Rosa Building Group, Melville Charitable Trust, and Wells Fargo. We're grateful to our collaborating sponsors, Bank of America, Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, and Key Bank. And thank you to collaborating sponsors, Rockport Mortgage and Webster Bank. We also have a host of amazing supporting sponsors that have helped make this conference happen again this year. And if you would like to support the CAHC, you can make a donation using this QR code. Thank you for your support. Just a quick note that registration is now open for our final iForum of the year. We can't believe it's almost December. Tenant-based subsidies in Connecticut, equitable expansion, held on Tuesday, December 6th from 10 to 12 p.m. The iForum will feature an overview of tenant-based housing subsidy programs in Connecticut, who accesses these programs, the deep positive impact housing subsidies have on households' quality of life, and how we can work to ensure equitable expansion of housing subsidies. This is a vital conversation for everyone, and we hope you can join us. I'll add a link for registration in the chat in just a minute. With that, we will get to today's plenary session, and it's my pleasure to introduce Susan Thomas, President of the Melville Charitable Trust, who will lead the conversation today. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Chelsea. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here, and thanks for coming and listening to our plenary today. We're talking about housing instability and how we can come out of the crisis that we've been in. I think we can now say that we're post-pandemic. Or at least we've learned how to navigate a world with COVID, right? And so we may be out of the crisis, but as we all know, many of our communities, particularly communities of color, are still living in crisis, or even at heightened levels of crisis in terms of their living conditions, their financial situation, their employment situation, their health situation as a result of COVID. And so, excuse me, we need to move forward now. We need to look ahead and really think about what needs to happen to strengthen communities and households of color, not only to minimize the impact of the next crisis that comes along and shore us up for that, but also to make sure that our communities are stronger, that they are more vibrant than they've ever been before. We don't want to go back to what was normal before, because that wasn't good enough for our communities of color. We want to make sure that our communities, our under-resourced communities, are resourced and that our households are stable. With me today are Lisa Rice, President and CEO of the National Fair Housing Alliance, and Marietta Rodriguez, President and CEO of NeighborWorks America, to talk about the level of instability that we're facing now post-pandemic and what they're seeing from their vantage points across their networks. Welcome, welcome, Lisa and Marietta. Please introduce yourselves and your organization and let us know the important roles that you are playing in our community.
Great. Thank you. I'll kick us off. Thank you so much, Susan. And it's such a pleasure to be here with you all today. The National Fair Housing Alliance is a national civil rights organization. We are the nation's only national agency totally dedicated to eliminating all forms of housing discrimination and creating vibrant, resilient, healthy and strong neighborhoods. We are also the trade association for fair housing groups throughout the country. So we have about 170 members peppered throughout the United States. And our members are both nonprofit organizations who work on the ground to provide direct services to consumers who experience housing insecurity and housing inequality. And our members also are comprised of governmental or quasi-governmental agencies that enforce their local fair housing ordinances.
Good afternoon. My name is Marietta Rodriguez. I'm the President and CEO of NeighborWorks America. I'm really happy to be here with you today and join both Susan and Lisa. For those of you that may not know, NeighborWorks America is a congressionally chartered public nonprofit. We support a network of more than 240 locally based housing and community development organizations all across the country, 7 of which are located in Connecticut. We also are one of the largest providers of training to the community development field through our virtual and in-person training events. And on occasion, we also serve as a way to get critical money out in times of crisis. So Congress appropriated some money during the foreclosure crisis of 2008 to help housing counselors through the National Foreclosure Mitigation Counseling Program. And they did something similar during the pandemic for housing counseling with the funding of $100 million in the Housing Stability Counseling Program. So my comments will really come from both what we're learning from the network across the country, but also those grantees from the Housing Stability Counseling Program.
Thank you. And so as we stand back now, and we have a moment to kind of stand on the balcony and assess the damage from the pandemic, right? What are you seeing in your spaces and in your regions and across your networks that need immediate attention? What do we need to be paying attention to right now?
Well, I'll go first, Lisa, and then you can chime in. I think there's a lot that needs our attention. Obviously, there is such a lack of affordable inventory in housing, both on the rental and the for sale side. We had a lack of affordable inventory pre-pandemic, and it's even less so now. And that's driving up prices and competition. But it's really also impacting communities in that the affordability gap and the wealth gap is growing larger. And we don't have enough inventory in the development pipeline to meet the need. So that's a huge issue that we really need to think about. How do we solve on a local, but also statewide and national level? Individual families' budgets are tighter due to the pressures of increased inflation. So people have to do more with less money, and that's when housing is taking up a higher percentage of monthly expenditures. That's really a lot tougher. We're also hearing from communities that there is an increase of scam activity. both on the rental assistance side, but in the advent of student loan forgiveness. So it's really, consumers need to be aware, particularly some of our older residents, that they are not vulnerable to scam activity. And there is definitely a worry as eviction moratoriums expire. We're going to see many more evictions and a spike in foreclosures as a result of some of the programs also expiring. On a local level, and we think about organizationally nonprofits that are sort of on the front line of this crisis, we're also seeing some pressures around staffing and staff turnover and inability to retain and recruit the kind of skilled staff that communities and residents need to be responsive to some of these very complex issues. So those are some of the headlines that come up for me as I look across all of our programs.
Yeah, and I really have to echo the comments that Marietta made. We're seeing the same thing amongst fair housing organizations. The lack of affordable housing is really placing a lot of pressure on people. And when you think about it, when you think about inflation, particularly in this rising interest rate environment where the cost of a mortgage loan or a loan to build multifamily housing developments has doubled, essentially. So the amount of house that a person would have been able to afford just 7 or 8 months ago has now been cut in half. And that is placing a ton of pressures and restrictions on what we're able to do. And I think what that means is very immediately we're going to have to ramp up solutions that increase affordability and solutions that we, I have to admit, typically have not embraced. So things like using 3D printing to cut the cost of housing. Now, this is something that communities are exploring with. I happen to be in Las Vegas right now, and there are a couple of projects out here in the West, in Nevada, in Arizona, where communities and developers have explored and experimented with using 3D printing to bring down housing costs. Now that means changes. That means changes in zoning. That means changes in people's perceptions about whether or not 3D printed houses will be attractive or will be safe, et cetera. That just brings into play a litany of things that we have to address at the local level and at the statewide level in order to bring on these kinds of cost-cutting measures. It also means that we have to revisit our permitting policies at the local level, which may add to, maybe unnecessarily, add to the cost of building and developing housing. And I think we also, Susan, this rising interest rate environment means that we have to deal with people's impressions about the cost of housing. I think that people believe or come to expect that mortgage rates, what we're seeing now in terms of mortgage rates is uncharacteristically high, when the truth is that the current interest rate environment we're seeing is really the norm. What we experienced over the past several years was unprecedented. It was uncharacteristically low. And so we do have to right-size people's perceptions and their expectations. That's tough. That's tough when a year ago you could have afforded a house that was $500,000 in your community, and today you can only afford a house that's $250,000. That's a big blow to some people. And so we have to continue educating people and working collectively to bring down the cost of housing and to build and develop more affordable housing units. And then the last thing I'll say, Susan, is that unfortunately, we are seeing a rise in fair housing complaints. In just a couple of weeks, if not next week, the National Fair Housing Alliance will be releasing our annual trends report, which is a compilation. It kind of reflects the state of fair housing in America. And I am sad to have to say that we will be reporting the single largest number of fair housing discrimination complaints ever filed in our nation's history. That is coming amidst an environment of increases in hate crime activity. And it's challenging for all of us. We are living in a time when, unfortunately, discrimination has been normalized too much. And so we have to really get back to the place where we're not normalizing bias, we're not normalizing hate activity, we're not normalizing discrimination, and we're not normalizing this notion that if you hold a possession or an asset, like a house that you are renting to someone, or or loans that you will be providing to someone, that it is your right to dictate who gets access to that asset based on your personal beliefs. We got to get away from that.
I didn't realize that we were facing a rise in fair housing complaints. That has huge implications, particularly on the populations that we support, populations that the trust supports. What are you hearing, and what do you think that is attributed to?
Yeah, well, it's making Marietta's job tougher, and it's making my job tougher. It's not easy. It's really attributable to coming off of the heels of 4 years in which we did have an administration that did not support fair housing, and was very open about it, very brazen about it, weaponized things like fair housing, weaponized things like fair housing and affordable housing. And quite frankly, an administration that said, if you teach people about systemic racism, you will not be able to access federal funds. I mean, that's huge. Yeah. That's really huge. And unfortunately, that hate activity, people think that when our leaders say things that are laden with hate language, that it really doesn't matter. Oh, well, that's right. Just leaders' perspective. But no, it has far wide and far-ranging implications.
Yes, yes. And it gives permission, right? And I guess that's what we're seeing. Marietta, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, what I found, but I want to comment on something Lisa indicated about the interest rate environment. So she points out that we've been living through historic interest rate lows, and that what we're seeing now are more normalized, if you look at history, more normalized interest rates. But during a span where we had the lowest interest rates in perhaps our generation, we also had the lowest rates of homeownership being achieved by communities of color. In other words, the gap of white homeowners to homeowners of color grew. You would think that lower interest rates would make ownership more accessible, but in actuality, the opposite took place. And we could probably talk about why that is. Maybe the low, I don't know, these are hypotheses that we could probably spend the entire day debating, but I'm wondering if the low interest rates took the pressure off of us to really be creative in pushing in pushing the envelope, that in a higher interest rate environment, there's more pressure. And then again, as I said earlier, we had less inventory entering the pandemic. We had a real shortage when we entered the pandemic, and it's even exacerbated now. I don't know, Lisa, if you thought about it, but as you said that, like it really struck me that this environment has actually, the normal interest rate environment is true, but it's just going to make things so much harder on the affordability side.
And you know, that gap, I mean, the gap was exacerbated after 2008, right?
Right.
After the 2008. So we've been here before, after the 2008 crisis, and there are still families of color in neighborhoods of color that still have not recovered.
Absolutely.
And we don't know if they ever will recover and get back to the level of assets that they had before.
Right.
And so coming out, I mean, looking back at history and seeing where we are now, what were some of the things that we did well coming out of the 2008 crisis that we should be thinking about doing now? And also, almost as important, or maybe even more importantly, what are things that we did not do that we should have, and that we should do those things now?
I think there are a lot of lessons learned that we could pull forward from the 2008 crisis. I think what the pandemic illustrated to us really clearly, something that probably everyone on today's session understood, was that when someone is stably housed and safely housed, a lot of things in their life can get better. During the pandemic, people were accessing their employment by being housed and access to broadband. They were educating children. In some cases, they were accessing telehealth, all from their home. But when they didn't have a safe, affordable home, it threw their entire world and community into further chaos in the middle of the pandemic. I think one of the things that happened in the 2008 crisis that we could pull forward is a notion of alignment across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. So during that crisis, pretty early on, that started early, frankly, in the George Bush administration and moved into the next administration, was getting federal, state, local, and nonprofit partners around the same table to strategize and share data about what was working locally. And really that gave the birth to some of the most successful strategies that we saw in the foreclosure crisis. It gave birth to the HARP and HAMP modifications. It gave birth to a public awareness campaign that was rippled throughout the country, but supported by lenders and state governments and nonprofits. So I think what it recognized, whether intentionally or unintentionally, is housing in and of itself does not exist in a silo. It exists as part of a larger system in community. And I think we've seen that in the pandemic as well. Impacts on housing impact education and healthcare and employment. And I think we really need to think about how do we build an infrastructure at the national and local and regional levels that recognize these interdependencies and the importance of cross-sectoral work. And that can sustain and be ready for the next crisis in terms of communication, in terms of coordination of resources, in terms of just public awareness. It's really hard if you're going through a foreclosure, or if you're going through at risk of eviction, or having some sort of financial crisis. It's very hard, or a health crisis for that matter, to figure out from all of the information in social media and on the web, to figure out what resources there are and then figure out how to pursue them. And I think nonprofits and communities have played this quarterback role of triaging resources and directing people to the right places, whether it's their state housing finance agency or the state division of housing or their county health system, but they play this role. And I think it is a critical role that is somewhat largely been unrecognized, and we need to resource it and recognize that we need these resources in the community that residents trust, that can go to and get reliable information, and really resource that cross-sector work with intention, and not just during a crisis, because we need it in a crisis, but we need it even when the community is not in crisis. So I think those are some of the lessons, feeding it and carrying it in between crises, and making sure that there is alignment, that people know who the go-to people are at both a national, but also a regional and local level.
Lisa.
Yeah, I second everything that Marietta said. During the 2008 crisis, we basically had to build the infrastructure to help people preserve their homeownership and housing opportunities. And to a very large degree, when the COVID pandemic hit, we could go back and dust off some of those systems and solutions. Now, they had to be revamped. That doesn't say that they didn't need to be upgraded, but we kind of knew we had a playbook to start from. And I have to say that we did put in place a number of things that we did not do during the 2008 crisis. So, for example, during the 2008 crisis, we bailed out the financial institutions. And we did not bail out the consumers. And I think we found that that really didn't work, because we bailed out the financial institutions, and what did they do with that bailout money? They gave themselves bonuses. They paid their investors. They did all kinds of things rather than investing in systems that would help save people from homeownership. They didn't do that until the federal government said, no, you got to do this. Participating in HAMP and HARP is not an option for you. Get to work. So this time around, though, we bailed out the consumers at the same time that we bailed out and supported businesses. So during the CARES Act, we said, look, everybody, if you need a forbearance, you get a forbearance, and we're not going to make you go through a plethora of questions in order to get you a forbearance. You get a forbearance. And we did other things too. We implemented funding for the emergency rental assistance program right away. Now, during the second COVID package is when we created the Homeowners Assistance Fund that states are implementing right now. But in that first COVID package, the CARES Act, we did also, in addition to the Emergency Rental Assistance Fund, we implemented the Child Tax Credit Program and the Paycheck Protection Program, and many, many other things to help families not lose their housing and to remain stably housed. We also did things like put in place and sort of reinstitute, and maybe even I would say improved, the post forbearance range of solutions so consumers could have a soft landing. So mortgage payment reduction, tacking on your mortgage payments at the very end of your loan, using partial claims from the government-sponsored programs, extending the term of the loan note, reducing interest rates. All of those things helped people after they left the forbearance plans to get sort of reinstated and get their sea legs back. And as a result, I think, Susan, we've kept millions of consumers in their homes and helped them avoid foreclosure. If you'll remember, when the COVID pandemic first hit, everybody was predicting that we were going to have a 2008 repeat. We were going to have the COVID foreclosure crisis. That never happened. And it never happened because we were intentional.
Yeah.
We were intentional and we pushed. And if we keep being intentional and if we keep pushing, then we won't see a plethora of foreclosures as these interest rates continue. Hopefully they won't rise anymore. Hopefully we've stopped. The other thing that I'll say is that we have, this landscape of housing counselors and fair housing counselors who are already trained and who could help consumers kind of navigate through these loss mitigation solutions. And if I could lift up something that we still need to do that we haven't yet done, and that is adjusting the FHA partial claim program. In the rising interest rate environment, when people are going to get their FHA mortgages revamped, they're finding out that because interest rates are higher, their mortgage payment would be higher. So we've asked the administration, is there a way we can use that FHA partial claim to pay down the interest rate so that the consumer gets a lower payment and can remain in their home?
Excellent, excellent. I'm thinking back to what you said, Marietta, as both of you were talking about this, coming out of this crisis, and you said, housing is not in a silo. And we continue, and I say we, society continues to think of housing as this separate thing that has nothing else to do with the rest of our lives, with our health and our education, with our economic mobility, with our ability to access jobs and transportation, with our social capital. Where we live has everything to do with that. And so when I think of all these federal dollars coming out, and I didn't, this just perked up, so I'm using my facilitator privilege to add this in, but I think of these federal dollars coming up, and and it seems to be like a separate thing, right? We have these infrastructure dollars, we have the Inflation Reduction Act dollars, we still have ARPA, that just came, the second tranche just came out, and then there's housing, and I'm always thinking, but infrastructure is for what? It's for where we live. And so what can you tell us? What should we be thinking about? We're talking about housing, we're talking about housing stability, we're talking about building strong neighborhoods, right? And thriving neighborhoods of color. What should we be thinking about as these other dollars are coming out?
I think we have to think about how what this investment is intended to cover, and then what are the gaps, right? I think so often, particularly nonprofits, but governments too, but as community groups are trying to access these dollars, they really sort of morph their service delivery to consumers or to the community based on how they need to report out the use of the dollar. And so that becomes the focus, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. We need those dollars, we need that investment in community, but then there are gaps that are just not covered with those dollars. And so I think what we need to think about is what's available and in what amounts against the need in that community, and how can philanthropy or other funders fill those gaps. It might mean, for example, in terms of, let's just say infrastructure, in some places you may need people to manage development projects in communities that haven't seen a development project in many years. And so there just isn't there isn't that kind of resource there. And so how do you build, how would a funder build capacity of a pipeline? I mean, one of the things that I hear a lot from our network is the lack of skilled and enough development bandwidth. They have to, our network does a lot of development, and they're getting very creative out of necessity about the kinds of investment stacks of dollars they have to put together to make a development happen.
Yeah.
Which is a miracle in and of itself, given the cost of development. But they still
especially for affordable, right?
Especially for affordable and the amount of subsidy. And then and in addition to that, so they need to be able to develop that, but they need a team that can manage that actual development. And often that kind of resource is very costly, and they can't retain the staff because that staff likely will get poached to a for-profit developer who can pay them a lot more. So it's this constant churn of how do we retain skilled staff in an environment where I can't pay them as much just because of the nature of my business. So that's a huge gap. How can philanthropy and others try to work to build this pipeline and help them retain and be competitive so we can get more of these units online? That would be like an example of stepping back and putting what's available and what are the gaps and how can we fill them? And that's a conversation that should be had across, as I said before, cross-sectorally, across a region or a community, and how can we create the opportunity for that kind of conversation, and who can play the leadership role in convening that kind of conversation that's really focused on that can really build alignment across all the sectors and all the players in a community, and break through some of the silos and the territorialness sometimes that happens in community can also undermine this kind of work.
And what was really eye-opening for me when I was thinking, Lisa and I were talking about these federal dollars coming out and needing to understand what's available for us and understand the relationship between what we're trying to do and these other dollars. And she said in Austin, was it Austin you were telling me about, where in the neighborhoods of color, the sewer system is uncapped, right?
Oh, in Houston, that was Houston.
Yeah, okay.
We have so many examples.
And in the resourced communities, the white communities, the sewer systems were capped. So even if we were able to figure out that capital stack, even if we were able to have the talent and the capacity to develop, you couldn't really do it in the communities of color because they don't have the infrastructure to handle it. And so Lisa, I'd love to hear you can talk to that much better than I can. What do we need to be doing?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Susan. And the example you were talking about is in Houston, Texas, but it's not just Houston, it's all over the United States. And I mean, Marietta can give you a gazillion examples of this too. But in Houston, the sewage system, and everybody knows that Houston floods a lot. They have a lot of storms. And so it's really important for communities to have a really good drainage system to drain off those flood waters when the floods happen. Well, in Houston, over 90% of the African-American and Latino homeowners live in neighborhoods where the drainage system is an open ditch drainage system. It's literally a ditch in front of your house, and you just have to wait for the water to subside. Whereas, as you pointed out, Susan, in the well-resourced communities, using federal dollars, not private dollars, using federal taxpayer dollars, the city of Houston implemented a sort of state-of-the-art drainage system in predominantly white, well-resourced communities. And what that does, what it has done is it has resulted in those communities of color over flooding. So now they're experiencing more flooding because the drainage from those well-resourced communities that water drains off and kind of pushes into the areas that don't have really good quality infrastructure. And so I think one of the things that we are seeing, and we're trying to utilize this more in our programming, Susan, because you talked about bringing these different sectoral players together to address these issues. And under our Keys Unlock Dreams initiative, this is an initiative where we're trying to close the racial homeownership and wealth gaps. We are bringing in non-conventional, like non-traditional partners, like healthcare institutions. And I know Marietta is doing this a lot too, but we're working with hospitals. We're working with technology firms. We're working with large employers in communities, because those entities are realizing, well, the healthcare facilities have realized the social determinants of health, and that they are very much related to where people live, right? So I talked about that example in Houston. Same thing is going on in Cleveland. The hospitals in those under-resourced neighborhoods are noticing that they're getting tons of children coming in with asthma problems and respiratory problems. Why? Because they're living in mold-infested housing. So hospitals are realizing there's a deep connection between housing and health outcomes. Employers are realizing there's a deep connection between housing and employment outcomes. And so we're bringing those kinds of partners to bear. And I think that the philanthropy industry can really help us deepen and grow those kinds of partnerships, because it really does take a village.
And so in an effort to make our communities more stable, there are many barriers. You know, you've talked about a few, Marietta. You talked about not having the expertise and the capacity and the infrastructure for decision making. We talked about the federal dollars and how the difference between resourced and under-resourced neighborhoods. What other barriers are impacting our ability to ensure that we can increase stability in our communities of color? And what advice do you have for people in the field on how they can address these barriers? What solutions are there? So barriers, what are the barriers that we're facing? What are the solutions that you're seeing?
I can kick us off on that question, Susan. So, you know, there are a lot of barriers that we still are grappling with that were born out of our nation's deep legacy of racism and inequality. You know, throughout the history of our nation, we have passed literally thousands of race-based laws, and we've spent trillions of dollars creating racial inequity. So think about all of the Jim Crow laws that were put in place in the aftermath of the ending of slavery. So even if you forget all of the laws that we put in place during the institution of slavery in America, post-slavery, we passed a bevy of laws that were race-based. And those race-based laws created things like restrictive zoning ordinances, which were designed to keep people of color and other low and moderate income people out of certain communities. But those restrictive zoning ordinances are still on the books. Most of them are still in place. People have forgotten the origins of those laws, but they're still on the books. And they're still driving inequality. They're still doing what they were designed to do. We have an inequitable infrastructure landscape, as we were just talking about. That if I go back to the zoning piece for 1 minute, one of the things that happened in many, many different communities is laws and policies were put in place to create residential segregation. That's another system that we're still sort of laden with, if you will, we are more segregated today than we were 100 years ago, right? And that segregation is creating and fomenting, continuing to foment inequality. But once communities and jurisdictions created segregated neighborhoods, they then rezoned those neighborhoods of color to industrial use, non-residential use, commercial use. It can be very difficult sometimes to get a mortgage loan when your house is in a neighborhood that is zoned industrial, right? So we have these kinds of barriers to deal with. We also have an appraisal system that is structurally unfair. There's a lot of human discretion involved in our modern day appraisal system. And as a result, on average, homes in communities of color are undervalued by about $43,000. Now, for Black homeowners, that's a cumulative loss of wealth of about $156 billion. So we have I didn't name all of the systems, the dual credit market, biased technologies, and on and on. We've got many, many structures and systems that are embedded with bias that we have to overhaul and then create new systems and structures that are fair and equitable for people. And of course, the way that we do that in the fair housing movement is we use the fair housing laws in order to dismantle those unfair systems and then create more systems that are fair.
Marietta.
You know, we've talked a lot about obstacles or challenges, right? Lack of affordable inventory, raising interest rates, staffing challenges, I think at the end of the day, what it all boils down to, and I for the sake of being overly simplistic, it's a matter of community will. Like, do we want to solve this or not?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, there needs to be will to do this. This country can do tremendous things when we have alignment around will. And I think that's really what it comes down to. Like, let's resolve this and put all of our resources to bear to make sure that our residents and communities can provide housing that is safe, decent, and affordable. It's quite simple. It's these other structures and things and territorials that sort of get in the way, I think, of some of that. The logic answer is, well, Marietta, is anyone doing that? Well, I think people are trying. I look at, a community like St. Louis that has suffered some incredible racial and economic disparities over the last decade. They have, it always boggles me, but the St. Louis area, I think, has like 24 municipalities. Like, it's broken up into these, very small, but they've come together and they're working as a region to resolve the economic and housing disparities once and for all. And they have a large strategic plan that spans a decade that they've all bought into and that they're investing in. I think when we step back, we need to think comprehensively about communities and really agree on the will to resolve this once and for all, frankly.
So Angela Glover Blackwell says, we're not a poor country, we need to stop acting like one. And so what I hear you saying is exactly. Again, coming back to this cross-sectoral structure, is we need to come together. And we can do it.
We can do it.
We have the tools. We have the ability.
We have the tools, and we have
the money, and we have the resources.
Yeah.
To really ensure stable and thriving communities. Right. That's what I'm hearing.
And we need to start sharing the narrative that strong communities that are equitable benefit everyone.
Yes.
I was several years ago, I was at a conference of the National Association of Real Estate Editors, and we were in Miami. And an editor stood up and said, well, I get what you're saying, Marietta, about affordable housing, but, you know, I live in one of the most expensive zip codes in the country. And so I just don't know what we can contribute to that. And I was like, let's think about it. The residents in your zip code still need support services. They still need paramedics and kindergarten teachers and nurses, and they still need to live in your community, and ensuring that people are housed equitably and have choices should matter, even into your most expensive residents. Like I don't know why that's lost on people.
I think it's lost. It's lost because we have sort of a tradition in this nation of thinking about resources and resource allocation in terms of a zero-sum net game, right? If
That's true.
If I win, if you win, I lose. And that's not the case. Study after study after study has shown that if we eliminate racial inequality in America, we will increase the US GDP by over $1 trillion each year. We're actually holding back our own collective productivity and success. We're actually stopping ourselves from being globally competitive and increasing and buoying our economy by expending our resources and energies and talents on holding other people back.
Yes.
Like, what if we redirected that energy and those resources and that intelligence and creativity to increasing and broadening equality and inclusion? We would all benefit the more from that. Like, as Marietta said, it's utterly ridiculous that we're not doing this.
It is. We have a couple questions in the chat. The first question, is there any traction for a HUD-insured loan product for BIPOC individuals to provide homeownership, to give BIPOC individuals choice to any neighborhood?
That is a great question. So I don't know if it's necessarily a traction for a HUD program, but there are programs on the books now. They're called special purpose credit programs. And earlier or last year, HUD released very needed guidance that basically states that special purpose credit programs do not violate the Fair Housing Act. So special purpose credit programs are a way to provide credit access in a very deliberate and targeted and intentional fashion to underserved groups. So a lending institution or even a nonprofit organization could establish a special purpose credit program within the confines of the law. So you have to comply with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Fair Housing Act. But you can design a program, for example, for Spanish-speaking consumers, or for African-American consumers, or for Native American consumers, or for people with disabilities. You're designing a program that is sort of targeted to an underserved group who is having difficulty or inability to access credit in the mainstream financial market. And if you want more information about special purpose credit programs, please go to our website. We have a toolkit that we developed in conjunction with the Mortgage Bankers Association. It's spcptoolkit.com. spcptoolkit.com.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Another question is that Lisa talked about the increase in discrimination complaints earlier. We heard about fair housing enforcement in Connecticut and fair rent commissions. Can you talk more about other states that are combating these increases in fair housing complaints?
Oh, sure. Great. Marietta just talked about St. Louis and what they're doing there. We saw that in Minneapolis. By the way, the mayor of Minneapolis ran on a fair housing platform. Mayor Prey, yeah. And won handily. So we see cities like Minneapolis sort of eliminating single family zoning and putting lots of supports behind the building and development of affordable housing units. We do see communities using rent control in order to tamp down on rising rental costs. Now, one of the challenges we face here, and I'll turn it over to Marietta, is the proliferation of corporate investors who are buying up housing units, condominiums, single family homes, et cetera. They're increasing rental rates, and it has nothing to do with supply and demand. They're raising interest rates just because they can, and they have a monopoly in certain communities. And we've seen a bevy of solutions to address that challenge as well.
Marietta, any comment?
No, I would agree with absolutely what Lisa said. I think different communities are combating it differently. But I am seeing more traction, certainly at the city and neighborhood level. Different ordinances, inclusionary zoning, other things that people are regulatorily trying to close this loop.
Okay. So there's another question real quick. We're coming up on our hour. Someone asked, are there any examples that either of you have seen of community reparations programs that provide Black residents with funds for home ownership as a form of reparations for housing discrimination?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Marietta.
No, please, Lisa, you probably have a more, yes, please.
Yeah, so a couple, Evanston, Illinois, has a reparations program to try and, it's not fully funded, but it's a down payment program to try and correct for past discrimination against African Americans. It was past discrimination perpetuated by the city of Evanston against Black residents in that community. The state of Oregon also created a reparations fund. Now they were sued, but I think they were sued a little bit after the fact. And they did implement, I think they spent all of that money. State of Oregon did that. I think it was called the Black Fund, if I'm not mistaken. I'll try and look it up before we end and put it in the chat. But we also saw at the federal level, the federal government try to give reparations to Black farmers, Latino farmers, and that effort has been held up because a lawsuit was filed against the federal government to stop the implementation of that program.
Yeah. I want to thank both of you so much for this session, for coming and speaking with us. I want to end with just one thought, one parting thought from you. If you had to finish the sentence, if only, how would you finish that sentence?
If only we had more time, more money, more will. Think about what we could do. I mean, I feel like we, at a national, but certainly at a community level, people are doing incredible things and incredible work that's having impact. What if we had just a little more?
Yeah.
Ditto. I'm girl. Marietta's my sister, right? In the movement, I'm giving you all kinds of snaps and amens. And I would just add to that, what if we had more understanding and empathy?
Yes. Amen to both of that. Well, thank you so much for ending on those notes. Something for us to take away, something for us to aspire to.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.